The 60s, Silicon Valley, California, American West Coast. Time of revolution that changed everything. A time when hippies, freaks, and hobbyists dreamed of having their own computer. Until then, only corporations, some universities, and the government had expensive, large computers. A small computer for everyone? Impossible, inconceivable, unheard of.
I would say the West Coast Revolution is the revolution of the second half of the 20th century. It's the revolution that has swept the world more than communism or any national movement. There isn't a single facet of human life that hasn't been touched and isn't being transformed right now by the revolution of small computers.
The pioneers of the personal computer believed in a better world. The power of mainframe computers could be snatched from the monopoly.
We were all leftists. I mean, there's no such thing as a Republican computer programmer from the 70s. It simply didn't happen. I mean, everybody was anti-war, anti-Nixon, and using personal computers to take power was the eventuality that came out of the left. And people really did walk around in sandals and eat brown rice and take LSD. If that's not a leftist position, I don't know what is.
Silicon Valley is a magical place. People ask me all the time, why is it so? I think it started because there were so few natives here. There wasn't a deep history. California has always been a place that has attracted adventurers and gold seekers, and it has a history of that. It has a history of being an integration place.
I think there's a spirit in the valley that encourages innovation. There's a lot of people willing to take a risk for the possibility of a reward. And the reward could either be financial, or the reward could be that a lot of people are using what you did.
The origin of Silicon Valley goes back to 1848 when they discovered gold in the gold country. And there was such a rush, an authentic gold rush. And they came and did something totally extraordinary. They dug money out of the ground. And it changed everything. It brought a capital to California as had never been done. And that led to rushes of all kinds here. We had the railroads, we had real estate, shipbuilding, Hollywood. It goes on. And then in 1900, we invented the electronic age here, when Lee DeForest came up with the vacuum tube.
So Americans came as far west as they could get. They couldn't go any farther, but they looked out onto this beautiful blue ocean, and they were kind of separate from the East Coast, so they had permission to do things. So the earliest computer pioneers in the 50s were very innovative out here. There was almost nothing going on, so they learned how to share resources.
When you come across the United States from New York to the West Coast, you shed rules. You come here out to the California, and there's nothing but the great blue edge of the Pacific Ocean, nothing to stop you. So geographically, it's free. If, you know, and all these kids were hitchhiking up and down Highway 1, which is nothing but ocean and a little bit of land. And Beach Boys, you know. We'll have fun, fun, fun.
People like Steve Jobs would never have survived on the East Coast because they had basically zero weirdness tolerance. And California has a lot more weirdness tolerance, which proved to be to its advantage in this situation.
I landed in California and went up to Berkeley and met some people, met one gal that ended up taking me to a nudist camp down in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which was my first experience with group nudity. This is really cool.
The people that came to California weren't the people who were perfectly content to stay where they were back on the East Coast. California was settled by people who were dissatisfied somewhere else. It was colorful and new because it followed after a long period of fairly strong, rigid conformity. And all of a sudden, everybody was questioning everything.
I was an electrical engineer at IBM, and from there I went into sales at IBM. From there I went into management. So I did many, many things at this big company. Which was quite wonderful. At the time, my life was very successful. Good education, had good health, good job, living in Silicon Valley, beautiful, beautiful, lovely wife, nice home. But there was something else, there was something more.
I would go up to San Francisco and especially to Berkeley for my social life, and it was great. I mean, the boomers were the most secure generation probably in history. Their families had really worked very hard to provide security, and so boomers felt secure. Once you have security, it's safe to experiment, to try new things, to go new places. To think new thoughts. And many of them looked back at their families and said, whatever happens, I don't want to be like that.
Those young people had been brought up during the 1950s with a lot of material things. It was fun, but wasn't real. It was superficial, just like I felt. There's something more than this nice life.
So that was going on, much of it driven by the anti-war movement, by the fact that the males had a good chance of being dragged off to Vietnam to become cannon fodder.
60,000 of those young men died, and 150,000 of them came back wounded. So my generation was decimated. The traditional males were gone. They had enlisted like their fathers had wanted them to do, and the non-traditional males were the artists, the musicians, the wild thinkers. So a generation kind of formed out of that, and it actually created so much music, you know, the protest.
On the American West Coast, the University of Berkeley becomes one of the centers of protest against the war in Vietnam. University administration wants to ban the demonstrations.
This assemblage has developed to such a point that the purpose and work of the university have been materially impaired.
But the students won't let anyone shut them up. With the free speech movement, they fight for freedom of expression on the campus. Folk singer Bob Dylan describes the young generation's way of life. In 1964, he writes a song that becomes the anthem of the counterculture. The times, they are a-changin'. The times, they actually do change.
When I came to Berkeley, I was interested in participating in not only bohemian society. I understood the beatniks in San Francisco, but also the activities against political repression. So I was politically active in a sense of protest.
You could not say that hippies launched the computer revolution. Some hippies were involved, some extremely buttoned-down people were involved. But it was a scene where you were especially valued by what you could come up with, and much less about all this incidental stuff like what you happened to be wearing at the time, or, you know, what music you liked or whatever. If you were good at whatever technical thing you were good at, you had respect for your actual skills and accomplishments, and not for all this side nonsense.
I keep thinking of what to design and build that can be useful. And around 1966, I started to figure out how can I build portable amplifiers, bullhorns, as we call them. I also built in the means of networking these things together with audio. So the idea was that the crowd could talk back to somebody else who was trying to talk to them. That was the beginning of my ideas of multilateral communication.
Just as today the public doesn't trust big media, big corporate media, then they had no other options. All you had was 3 television networks. You had big newspapers owned by big conglomerates. So the hippies and maybe the public didn't trust that, but they didn't have any other options.
Communication at eye level, where anyone is allowed to say something, an outrageous concept. The liberal ideas of the students are, however, not politically powerful.
But we do know that they know life.
In 1966, Ronald Reagan becomes governor of California, a conservative hardliner who had demanded a firmer stance against the protesters in his election campaign. But the young generation remains in a state of upheaval.
Some of my friends were experimenting with communal living, and we're talking about living in the country, going back to the land, growing your own food, things like that. And I was a city boy. I grew up in the Bronx, and it was just fascinating to me to get involved in these outdoor activities and constructing our own shelters.
You know, there were lots of threads that were happening at the same time. It was not a monoculture. It was not a unified world. And so there was a part of the counterculture that rejected technology, and then there was the part of the counterculture that I think Stuart Brand represented very well, this notion that you had to appropriate the tools, and this was what personal computing was about. You had to appropriate the tools for your own culture. So Buckminster Fuller was happening at the same time that there was a very powerful back to the land movement happening.
Buckminster Fuller was one of the icons of the hippie movement because he was an out-of-the-box thinker. Even though he was an old man by the time the hippie ethos came, the hippies built his geodesic domes. They grooved on his ideas of new forms of community, being able to put a dome over a city and save energy, or to build a new way of living. And Bucky was kind of a hippie before his time.
It's very pleasant to be warmly greeted.
Buckminster Fuller. His ideas were far ahead of the nation's technology. Buckminster Fuller has lived to see a skeptical world come to believe in him, and his idea that man was born to succeed.
Fuller pointed out that the future of humanity had to be utopia or oblivion. And a lot of people understood that also, I did, and they were ready for the technology that meant a lot.
A lot of engineers worked for bigger mainframe style companies, but those same engineers dreamed of having their own computer at home.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running.
The 60s end with a technological triumph. On July 21st, 1969, Neil Armstrong is the first man to walk on the moon.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Suddenly, everything is possible. Technical enthusiasm and the desire to move boundaries. One who would later change the computer world cannot be pigeonholed. Neither hippie nor hobbyist, an individualist.
Steve Jobs was at the very end of the counterculture. I mean, he was a half a decade sort of behind the sort of peak. But Jobs, he was very influenced by Dylan and Joan Baez, and all of that stuff was sort of part of his worldview. And he was that mix of business and this view that computers could be this empowering tool.
Steve and I became friends in our first month of college at Reed College because we were both interested in the Be Here Now book, which was about psychedelics and spirituality. Actually, I'm the world expert on all the books that Steve and I read that made us want to go to India. My friendship with him was about reading these books and going to the Hare Krishna temple on Sunday nights and taking psychedelics on the weekends and that kind of thing.
He came to the small Zen group that we had years ago. He had just returned from India, had dropped out of college, and was still searching. So he only did it for a short time until he found his real passion.
The funny thing about Steve was he never, ever talked about technology, really at all. Even though he had already been selling blue boxes.
Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, they had built blue boxes in high school, which were boxes that you could connect to the telephone system and dial calls nationally and internationally toll-free. Definitely illegal, but oh yes, this is fun.
Here's how it worked. In those days, the call billing information went through the same phone line as the phone call. So when you dial a number, you get a phone call, and then the next thing that happens is it's going to start billing
for the duration of the call. But if you blow the tone 2600, the central office thinks you've hung up. So it turns off the billing, but if you haven't actually hung up, now you get a free call. That was the whole secret. And Steve Jobs and Woz immediately built a prototype, and Steve Jobs said, well, let's sell these. And that was how their partnership started. If it wasn't for the blue boxes, there may well have never been an Apple. Computers would have happened, but his particular partnership with Steve Jobs first started with the blue boxes. And because that was a successful project for them.
Meanwhile, some former hippies are roughing up the academic system in Silicon Valley. They form a free, self-governing university. No rigid curriculum, no hierarchies. Technology and alternative lifestyles are no contradiction to them.
I heard about this free university, the Free University of Palo Alto, which was having all of these wild courses. And I looked into it and said, okay, I'll go over and take a look.
And while I was there, we grew it up to 3,000 people who were members of the Free University. So to be a member was, I think, $10.
Anybody could teach anything. There was a course on psychedelics. I started a course called To Be Gentle, having come out of Texas where there's no such thing as being gentle. That's not manly.
And that was, in a way, the antecedent of today's internet, where you can read any content you want, but you can also create any content you want, put it up there. The Free University made all that possible. I think it opened our eyes to what could happen if people both consumed and contributed.
You are never too young to teach, nor too old to learn. The most natural state of human beings is endless curiosity.
The first class that I led was computer related. It was called How to End the IBM Monopoly, about how IBM gained control of enterprise computing, which was pretty much all the computing there was at that time. They didn't care about ease of use. And so I thought we should get people together and come up with a strategy for dethroning IBM.
I think at the time, IBM was seen kind of like Microsoft is seen now, or like Microsoft was seen before Apple got quite as strong as it is now.
IBM completely dominated the world of technology. I think it was the CEO of IBM was quoted as saying that they estimated that there was a market for 6 computers in the United States, talking about big mainframes.
This is what computers looked like in the 1960s and 1970s. The size of them was intimidating. And there were some manufacturers who liked that, felt the computer should loom over the user and minimize them.
The computer was this great big thing in a room and people wore white coats. So it was almost like a priesthood at a temple. So the mainframe was there. It was, sometimes you could see it behind glass, but it was a priesthood of mostly men that were operating this thing and caring and feeding it. It wasn't something that was in your hand. It was something very, very distant and very powerful.
I had friends in college. They would sneak down into the basement, into the computer lab, to try to get time on this giant computer. And I went to see them when this computer filled a room, and they had punch cards, and they would do something with them and feed them into the computer, and out would come the answer, whatever that answer was. And they were completely enthralled with this. But I felt that it had nothing to do with me, because it was an enormous, monolithic, opaque machine. And I couldn't understand it. I couldn't have a relationship with it. It dwarfed me.
It was seen as a tool of control, of societal control, and a tool of concentration of power. If you couldn't afford this machine, you couldn't do what you could do if you could. The IBM way of doing things was very much a creature of East Coast culture. It was an old company and very conservative in their social concepts. When you joined the company, they would actually lift up your pants leg and see if your socks went up to your knee. That was very important to them. You had to wear a black suit and a blue tie, and the salespeople were taught company songs out of a company songbook.
Ever onward, that's the spirit that has brought us fame. We're big but bigger, we will be. We can live, walk, and see that serve humanity has been our aim. Our colors now are known in every tone. Our reputation sparkles like a gem. We want our way through and new. Feel the sure to conquer to the ever onward idea.
Those of us that were in the computer industry, young programmers, resented what IBM was doing to what we realized was a tremendously creative medium that should be under everybody's control, not just one gigantic company that had all the business. The biggest gripe I had about computers is that they had to be shared.
I was in search of machines that would help people form and maintain community. The agora, the plaza, the marketplace, and this agora has now been transformed into the mass media. So we come to the question of what do you need to do? I mean, as an engineer, I need to find my specifications somewhere. So we had, at the time, large computers to work with, and in fact, I wound up working with one such large computer. And I knew that we had to be able to do a kind of bulletin board.
3 decades before a company called Facebook goes online, a group of young computer freaks around Lee Felsenstein invented a small, local computer network in Berkeley. PCs are not yet available. The few public terminals are connected to a large mainframe computer.
This is a community memory terminal. Now, that was the first electronic public access social media. We wanted to set up a new information channel that was not controlled in the ways in which newspapers, broadcast media, and so forth were controlled. The direct intention of it was to provide a tool whereby people could create neighborhood and local information exchange centers. We had all kinds of interchanges. We had people who would type up typewriter graphics just to put it up there and so people could get it back by using the keyword they used. And we had a poet. He would enter some little lines of poetry and said, for more poetry, call the following number and talk to John.
Lee was one of the first to see that you could use personal computers as tools for both political and counterculture movements. And he had a very well-developed idea about the computer as a political tool. And he grew up in a socialist, communist family, and so he had these political values. He came to Berkeley. He was immediately in the student movement, but he also had these engineering background, and so he sort of blended that perspective. And he saw the computer not as a control tool, but as a liberation tool. Early on, very, very, very early on.
The first terminal was opened August 8th, 1973. Note, 1973 was before personal computers. I was afraid when we first set it up in Berkeley in a record store, very much a counterculture place, that they would be outraged. How dare you bring a computer into our wonderful little world we're creating? But that was not the case. Everyone looked at it and said, oh, can I use it?
Well, I fell in love with computers when I was in high school. I was lucky, even though it's pretty rare back in the late 60s. I was lucky to have a high school that had a terminal that was connected to a big computer far away. And I just took to it naturally, like a fish to water. I loved it. I loved being able to have an idea and then realize that idea by writing a program. Well, I knew I wanted my own computer. It just wasn't possible to have one.
There was a group of mostly young men in the Bay Area in the mid-70s who had this visceral hunger to get access to their own computer.
They wanted their own computer.
They weren't even sure what they were going to do with it when they got it, but they wanted to get it to explore.
And see what they could make it do.
They thought of these things as fantasy amplifiers.
Ted Nelson in 1974 published a book called Computer Lib. That was really the first articulation I saw of computers as a tool for the ordinary man and a counterbalance to sort of Big Brother. So it was an incredibly exciting concept that ordinary people could have their own computers as a counterbalance to the banks and government. And that really resonated with me.
And then the breakthrough, a small company which until now had only made pocket calculators, rather randomly brings a kit on the market, which would go down in history as the first personal computer.
And here it is, the personal computer of nerds' dreams, the Altair 8800, which was announced on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine in January 1975. And it mobilized nerds everywhere. What you can do with this is enter ones and zeros into the computer with these front switches. And then you can run your program. But what does the program do? It just runs these blinking lights. But for nerds in the mid-70s in Silicon Valley and everywhere else, this was like an explosion of glee that they could do this at home, and it was a real computer. It wasn't just a calculator that added numbers. It was a real computer.
It was revolutionary, and it was considered ridiculous by many people who couldn't understand the potential.
The orders were far beyond the capacity of the company, and people had to wait for their kits to arrive. And so at least one person drove to the company, which was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, quite literally in the middle of nowhere. They drove in a recreational vehicle and they camped in the parking lot, waiting for their computer. And when they got the computer, it was a kit, it was loose parts. They sat down inside the vehicle and assembled it, and they would have to go back and get help.
Now, in the mid-70s, hippie and protest movements have run out of steam. But the desire to change the world, not to be bossed around by anonymous, large corporations, that lives on. Not with flowers in the hair, but with the soldering iron.
Behind this is the marvel of the ultra-miniature integrated circuit and the microprocessor chip. This chip is a complete digital computer circuit, the equal of large computers of the past. It costs only $12 and lets amateurs make computers do what computers never dreamed of doing before.
People met in a garage on a rainy night in March and looked at this computer.
People got together, and it was entirely to sort of share the knowledge about hobbyist computers.
And somebody had decided, hey, let's start a computer club locally of nerds, of people who are interested in these microcomputers that you can get at a consumer price. The Homebrew Computer Club started in that dirt-floored garage when I went, but it quickly expanded to where it couldn't meet in that garage anymore. And so they went to Stanford and found a lecture hall and met there. And it was run as a benevolent dictatorship. One person said, okay, I'm willing to run the meetings. I'll be the interlocutor. That was Lee Felsenstein.
Now, I was one of those people, and I had my experience with community memory. So I knew that what you needed to do was to get the secondary information, that is to say, contact information. Who are these other people? What do they want to do? Who has what skill, what resources? It's just like the social media.
So one person would stand up and say, hey, I've got this problem with this particular program. Can anybody help me? Hey, I've heard that Intel is going to produce a new computer chip, microcomputer chip. Okay, yeah, what? Tell us a little about it.
Before money came into the picture, pretty much it was open sharing and giving. It was a thing that gradually empowered people. As a result of the excitement, they created something that was power to an individual. So the hippie ethos of the importance of the individual and the individual spirit and creativity rather than organizational man flowed right into the homebrew computer movement. And so they loved to take what they created in their bedroom to the homebrew club meeting and share it with their friends. At a homebrew club, a guy named Steve Dompier came with an Altair that they had programmed. They had switched in a program. Because they discovered that if they put an AM radio on the top and they ran this special program, the interference coming out of the machine would create tones on the radio.
He realized, I can make music with this. 30 hours later, he had a program that played music. He had to enter the program by hand on switches and lights, about 50 instructions. He entered The Fool on the Hill by the Beatles, and they said, wait. Had the radio there and turned it on, and it started playing da-da-da, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Very poorly, but still it was identifiable.
Standing ovation ensued at the Homebrew meeting with Lee Felsenstein waving his stick and declaring that the Altair actually did something for the first time.
And this amazed everybody. How had he gotten the music out of the computer, for instance? Even Bill Gates couldn't figure that one out.
This young man, college dropout and computer freak, would become the richest entrepreneur in the world. Bill Gates laid the foundation of his empire early, when most other nerds didn't even think about earning money.
Bill grew up in Seattle. He didn't grow up in the Bay Area. He went to Harvard. He was fascinated by computers, and he was really quite entrepreneurial. I mean, in that sense, Bill really had a business sense right from the beginning. He was very early to understand the power of computing, personal computing, and that you could put a computer in every home. He had that vision very early, but it was not a political vision. It wasn't a cultural vision. It was a technical vision.
When the microcomputer issue came out, Bill Gates and Paul Allen were already friends. And Bill Gates runs to his friend and shows him this. He goes, "Oh my God, we got to get on this right away."
He went to MIT's Altair and said, "Hey, you've got the MIT's Altair computer, but you don't have any software. I can give you a copy of BASIC, the basic computer language, as software, which will greatly enhance your product." The MIT's company said, "Cool, we'll sell it at, I think, $350 a pop." Some poor hobbyist in each area paid $350 for a copy of MIT's BASIC. And then suddenly there were multitudes of copies of these in the same area.
So we exchanged that BASIC. Somebody made up, I don't know, 20 copies and brought it back to the next meeting. Anybody who wanted one could take one.
Bill Gates noticed that people were not paying for his BASIC, which was basically a paper tape with holes punched in it, and it cost almost as much as the Altair computer, that people were just simply putting it into a paper tape reader and punching out another copy and giving them out.
Bill got very upset with this. By then, he and Paul had created Microsoft, and he wrote this really irate letter saying, "You hobbyists are stealing our life's blood. You're all a bunch of thieves and burglars.
How can we have good software and have a software industry if you guys are stealing software? You have to stop."
The culture of the Homebrew Computer Club right from the beginning was that you shared software, and software was this thing that amplified the machine. It made it work, and so of course you would share it. And there was, you have to remember, there was no software industry at that point.
I think this has been one of the conundrums in the early computing industry. It really is founded by renegades who liked to think of themselves as renegades. But the problem is renegades eventually have to make money too and want to be compensated for the work that they perform and the innovations they create. So there's always been this difficulty about, do we copy protect things? Do we put traces on things? How do we monetize our creations? And I think Bill is one of the first people who went on record saying, no, we need to be paid for this work. This work has value and we need to pay for it.
They got Gates' letter, and there was a fairly caustic reaction from the community. They just didn't agree with him.
Yes, it was probably theft.
Well, the early computer guys, it wasn't about money at all. It was, gosh, it was about the personal human connection. And they They saw beauty, a real beauty in computer code. It was like a romance, a love for coding, and a love for communicating and then using these tools and the very primitive early games, you know, little beep, beep, beep.
Wow. Oh. One more point. Yay!
We had this joystick that we used for games. That is a bicycle grip. After seeing Star Wars, my roommate, he actually wrote a program where you gunned down, you know, the oncoming fighters using the, you know, guiding with the joystick and firing with button. It's actually just a pipe. So the underlying stick was really short, and so there's like a piece of wood on that and a pipe jammed on that, and then a bicycle grip on that, and then the button put in the end. So that was our game playing tool.
The technical gadgets slowly become real as the first companies are founded. Apple at this time, still with its playful apple tree logo, is one of the early garage startups.
I stayed in touch with Steve, and in 1975, he went up to this farm in Oregon and fasted on apples. So we were living in the apple orchard. That's where the name Apple came from. And then the next year, Steve Wozniak created his computer prototype of the Apple I, and was demoing it Homebrew. And this was the first time that the Apple I was on display to the public. And that's me trying to look very serious and hoping that no one asks me any questions, because I didn't know anything. I didn't know how the computer worked. Steve Jobs knew how but at the show, it was mostly me standing at the booth while Steve and Woz went around to look at everybody else's stuff, right?
Oh, I knew both Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Jobs and Woz, through the computer club. Both of them were nerds. Jobs was sort of a visionary and a fantasizer. Woz was a doer. And they were friends, high school buddies and continuing friends after high school. Woz said, look, the Altair is nice, but I want a computer that works the way I want it to work. And Jobs said, sure, cool. So Woz did all of the hardware and all of the software design. Maybe Steve helped a little bit here and there, but he was not the primary producer of what came to be the Apple I.
I've always thought that that's the fundamental chemistry that is at the heart of Silicon Valley. A hacker who is interested in sort of pursuing this technology in its own right, and a guy who sort of understands the business. And you put those together in the right way and you get companies like Apple.
And that's how Woz and Jobs got started. Jobs was the entrepreneur, and he was the visionary who could see, hey, this could go farther.
Jim Warren had been a bit of a Dionysian personality and somebody who was very good at absorbing gossip and transmitting gossip. That he did at the meetings. If you look at the pictures we took at the Homebrew Computer Club. At one point, he is sitting in the back and everyone is turned to look at him. And so he then came up with the idea of holding a fair.
My idea of a computer fair was an expanded version of the Homebrew Computer Club, people talking about what they were doing, and if some people wanted to set up card tables outside and show off their products, that's fine.
Jim Warren, who was a member of the Homebrew Club and was sort of around locally on the Mid-Peninsula, realized that there was this need for a place for everybody to get together at a scale because there were all these businesses and products. And he set one up at a big auditorium downtown San Francisco, and it attracted huge crowds.
The personal computer is growing up and finally taken seriously. Vendors from all over the world travel to the San Francisco Computer Fair to see what started in Silicon Valley garages. The small gray boxes are not really personal yet. This will radically change only a few years later. And IBM, the big rival from the East Coast, is surprisingly entering the PC business before the World Wide Web changes our lives. The Silicon Valley revolution, it has just begun.